Now, in this section, we're going to cover from the years approximately 1910 to 1931. We'll cover the period from 1931 to 1945 in a later section. But for now, I want to give you kind of a rough chronology. The first period is what we call the period of military rule. That lasts from 1910 to 1919. We'll later have a period of what's called cultural rule, which will last from 1919. Usually we consider it to last till the 30s. I'm going to stop in 1931 in this section. But in this period of military rule, basically armed resistance would continue in Korea until about 1914, right? And about 14,000 Korean combatants will be killed. That's not including Korean civilians who were killed. There's a lot of them who were killed. And even then, armed resistance among Koreans does not cease. However, Koreans who want to fight have to flee to Manchuria or Russia if they want to continue the fighting the Japanese. And we'll see later on that Japan will expand its power into Manchuria. So if you were a Korean and you wanted to fight the Japanese, you could continue to do so in Manchuria. So one reason why the Japanese did run Korea during this period like a military colony in a sense, and focused on the military being in charge, was because there was an active war in a sense still being fought by these Koreans. In addition, there were severe restrictions on the public sphere in Korea. In particular, for example, Koreans were not allowed to freely assemble. There were no independent Korean newspapers. The only Korean newspaper allowed to exist was run by the government. So there were harsh restrictions on the public sphere in Korea. And what we have to note was that there were multiple Korean newspapers and journals before this time period. The Japanese government shut them all down. So there were serious restrictions on the public sphere in Korea. Right? People were not allowed to speak or to say anything publicly that might be taken as a threat to the Japanese colonial government. In addition, the Japanese government was trying to take over education completely. It wanted to have complete influence over education. This included religious schools. So, for example, in particular, they wanted to go after Protestant schools because, as we've mentioned before, a lot of the Protestant schools were run by the Americans and the British, and they naturally taught some American and British history. And American and British history is, in a sense, all about liberty. Right? The Americans, of course, talked about the American Revolution, but also the British have a history of liberty as well. So the Japanese government distrusted these American and British missionaries who were filling Korean students' ideas with any kind of liberty and belief in democracy and so forth. They didn't like that. So the Japanese government will progressively try and push religious schools out of business. And even if they do continue to exist, they're not allowed to talk about religion. For example, the Japanese government banned, if you had a school that was, say, run by a church, not only could you not talk about religion during school hours, you couldn't even have optional meetings in the school building after school hours for students who voluntarily wanted to learn about religion. That's how serious the Japanese government was about excluding any kind of religious influence from among the Korean people. And I want to stress they focused a lot on Protestants, but they also wanted to make sure Catholics and other people were not teaching the Koreans any kind of dangerous ideas, such as about George Washington or anything about that. And one thing that they did was also the Japanese government arrested a large number of important nationalists and tortured them in an effort to try and get them to cease their resistance. And that's a group of them. They're being let off to be put on trial. And I do want to highlight that the overwhelming number of these nationalists were Protestants. This is an important thing to understand about Korea that makes it a little bit unique. And this is one reason why Protestant Christianity is so powerful today in Korea, is this kind of nationalism of these Protestant Christians. So the Japanese government is coming down very, very, very hard on Koreans. And it's hard to find a colony in which you had people come down this hard on the colonial population. Right? If you compare this to the British in India, to the Americans in the Philippines, in some of the French colonies during this time period, as strict as they could be, this was even stricter. And it's one thing that made the Koreans very frustrated. And as Koreans are now trying to deal with this very new situation, where they're no longer independent, their understanding of what it means to be Korean is going to change. In the past, Korean identity had been built around the king. In fact, in the past, oftentimes Koreans did not refer to themselves as Koreans. They referred to themselves, for example, as Chosun people. So they emphasize the dynasty, right? Chosun is the name of the dynasty. And so people would say, I am a person of Chosun, rather than I am a Korean. And one problem with this, as we've seen before, is basically whoever controlled the king controlled the nation. In this traditional Korean political thought, sovereignty was located in the king, right? Sovereignty, the right to rule, was located in the king. In the United States, sovereignty lies in the people, right? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, right? That's how our Constitution starts. So in our government, we understand our sovereignty as coming from the people. But Koreans have traditionally understood sovereignty as coming from the king. The problem is, then if you controlled the king, you controlled the nation, right? Remember, as we've seen, poor Gojong and later Sunjong basically become under the control of the Japanese government. And poor Sunjong was essentially a puppet. The Yi family, who had governed Korea through the Chosun dynasty, will be incorporated into the royal house of Japan, right? Korean princes and princesses will be forced to marry Japanese princes and princesses. So what that means then is that, in a sense, the Korean kings, the Korean royalty, will essentially over time cease to be Korean ethnically. Many elite, many of the high people, the most powerful people, rather than resisting Japan, will choose to collaborate with Japan. They have the most to lose. They're the high Yongbon, the people that own lots of land, who have lots of wealth. If they resist Japan, they will lose that. So many will choose to collaborate. So what this means is the traditional ruling class of Korea, the kings and the Yongbon, have lost their legitimacy. They failed to protect Korea from the Japanese. They're weak and unable to resist the Japanese. So they're no longer considered legitimate, and Koreans are trying to understand new ways of what it means to be Korean, right? And previously, Korean identity had been built around the royal house, around the king. What's it going to be built around now? And in 1916, a very important Korean nationalist, a man named Shin Chae-ho, is going to write a book called A Dream of Heaven. And he puts forward this very simple idea, and I think this is one thing that makes this idea very powerful, is it's simple, is he argues that the state is equal to the body, and the nation is equal to the spirit. And even though the state, the body, has died, the spirit, the nation, the Korean people, is still alive. And the spirit then, since it's still alive, can retain its body, right? As long as we keep a Korean nation alive, it is possible that we can get a body again, meaning we can become an independent government, an independent nation state. For now, we need to cultivate the spirit. For now, we need to develop ourselves spiritually. He doesn't mean we have to be religious. He was actually pretty anti-religion. What he meant was we need to develop our martial skills. We need to develop our martial spirit. We need to become brave. We need to become strong. That's what we need to do. And if we do that, if we strengthen the Korean nation morally, spiritually, like I said, I don't think of spiritual as a religious way, but think of things like bravery, then we can one day regain our state and become an independent country. And in 1917, nationalist leaders of Korean nationalist leaders will have an assembly and declare that sovereignty does not lie in the Yi royals. It does not lie in the now basically defunct Chosun dynasty. It will instead argue that the sovereignty is in the Korean people themselves, right? Sovereignty is in the Korean people themselves. In a sense, there is a serious weakness, though, in the Japanese effort to control Koreans. During this time period, Japan had an alliance with Britain. You may recall, right? They had wanted that alliance in order for them to make sure that when they fought Russia, France would not be able to come in as well, because then Britain would come in the war as well. The Japanese, you may recall, wanted to avoid another triple intervention where they were ganged up on by European powers. So the British and the Japanese were allies. Therefore, the Japanese had to be very careful with how it treated those British missionaries that were in Korea. While it could pressure them on issues like education, it still had to allow the churches to be able to do things that normally go with religion, like having church services, preaching on Sundays, and things like that. So the Japanese had to be very careful not to make British missionaries too upset. That would hurt their relationship with Britain, which they had an alliance with that they needed. Likewise, the Japanese wanted to maintain friendly relations with the United States, and a lot of American missionaries helped to run these schools, and so the Japanese also wanted to avoid alienating Americans. And while the Japanese were willing to push the Americans in regards to schools, and they would argue we have that right because education is something that a government should be in control of, it was still understood that they had to leave churches alone when they were doing churchy things like preaching and having meetings at a church and so forth. So what happened then was that religion was one place where Koreans could assemble and talk. Now, I mean, literally, they had to talk. They couldn't write down much, but they could get together at a church service, and if they were careful, could complain about the Japanese and discuss how they were frustrated about Japan and organize ways to resist Japan. Right? So while Japan was able to exert a lot of pressures over religious schools because of their concern with American and British relations, they couldn't go too far. They couldn't be too strict towards the Koreans who were going to church and things like that. Now, in World War I, following the war, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, is going to help promulgate this idea of national self-determination during the Versailles Treaty peace talks in 1919. And the idea of national self-determination is very simple. The idea is that any nation that wants to have its own state should have its own state. And so Koreans will say, well, that's great. We don't want the Japanese here. We need to publicly declare that we as the Korean nation want to have an independent government, an independent state, and then according to this principle, we will get it. Now, during this time period, while these discussions are going on, the Emperor of Korea, Gojong, the old emperor, he will finally die. And his funeral, in a sense, will act as a magnet, as kind of a center for Korean protests, right? This will encourage Koreans to protest because his death really represents, in a sense, the loss of some of their ancient past. And this will give them a sense, okay, yeah, the last Korean independent monarch is dead. We, the Korean people, need to do something. Related to this, Christians and members of a new religious group called Chondogyo. Who are the Chondogyo? They're basically the descendants of Tonghak. It's the same religion, they just changed their name. So remember the Tonghak Rebellion? Those guys are still around. They're still nationalists, at least some of them are. And together the Christians, and I want to emphasize Protestant Christians, will organize resistance to the Japanese, particularly through religious organizations, basically their churches, and their schools. The students are very good, as you might guess, at keeping things hidden from their teachers. So as much as the Japanese tried to control schools, they maybe could control the teachers, perhaps, and the administrators, but they could not control the students. So Christians and members of Chondogyo will organize an independence movement through their churches, their religious organizations, and through their schools. And on March 1st, 1919, a Declaration of Independence will be issued by a group of these religious leaders. And I want to emphasize, something like only 2% of Koreans during this time period had a religious affiliation. Now, I don't mean that they didn't have any religious beliefs, but only 2% belonged to a religion. Most engaged in religious practices, such as praying at temples and hiring shamans and so forth, but they didn't belong to a religious organization. But in the Declaration of Independence, there's 33 signers. 11 are Protestant, 10 are members of Chondogyo, and 2 are Buddhist monks. So imagine that. Even though there's very few people in Korea who have religious affiliation, the vast majority, or all, I should say, of the Korean nationalists who signed the Declaration of Independence, all of them had a religious affiliation. So that shows how important religion was in this time period to this nationalist movement. So on March 1st, 1919, you have this Declaration of Independence, and basically then you have these demonstrations in which something like 1 million Koreans will end up participating in on this day and the months that follow it. They basically just go around waving Korean flags and shouting Korean independence for 10,000 years. Daehanmin국 Dongnep Manse, Korean independence for 10,000 years. And the Japanese are astounded because they thought they had control of Koreans. They thought that they knew they had a good spy network and they knew everything that was going on, and they were completely surprised by these demonstrations. They did not see these things at all. It was kept like completely secret. And the Japanese responded with violence, with massacres, with cavalry, like charging into crowds of Koreans and cutting people up with their swords, shooting down demonstrators. There's this incredibly violent response to this peaceful demonstration of Koreans asking for their independence in hopes that this policy of national self-determination will apply to their country. To give you a sense of how things are changing in Korea, as seen in the March 1st movement, I want to introduce one participant in that movement, a young lady named Yu Kwansun. Yu Kwansun was a girl from the provinces. Right? She was not from Seoul, the center. She was from the provinces. So in that way, she was kind of similar to An Chung-gun. Right? Remember, he's someone from the provinces, so he was excluded from traditional politics. Yu Kwansun would, of course, been excluded from traditional politics, both because she was from the provinces, but also because she was a woman, not a man. Now, one thing about Yu Kwansun, in some ways similar to An Chung-gun, is that she is going to convert to Christianity, but this is a different form of Christianity. She's going to become a Methodist. The Methodists in Korea were known particularly for building schools. And a missionary by the name of Alice Sharp, who Yu Kwansun came into contact with because her family had converted to Methodism and was very active in the Methodist Church, and so they were in charge of watching and basically taking care of the chapel when the missionaries were not around. She, Alice Sharp, noticed that Yu Kwansun herself was rather sharp, see what I did there, and arranged for her to go to a school in Seoul called Ihwa Hakdang, Ihwa Academy. Now, Ihwa was a big deal because it was the first school in Korea that taught or that offered a modern education to girls and young women. So Yu Kwansun, through her religious ties, her religious connections, is able to gain access to this school, right? She's plugged into this missionary network that's going to give her new knowledge, right? And one thing I tried to emphasize earlier was that believing in Christianity in this time period does not mean simply believing in particular things about Jesus, though that is included. It means being a believer typically in liberal democracy and ideas like that. And again, these are American missionaries principally, but even the British ones will be teaching ideas of liberty. And imagine this, you're Yu Kwansun, and you study American history because you're being taught that. And what is American history but the history of a group of colonies gaining their independence and becoming a powerful nation state? Wow, wouldn't that be great if Korea could do that as well? So Yu Kwansun is, through her religious beliefs, is also going to gain political beliefs and political interests. And because she's plugged into this network, she will take part in that March 1st, 1919 movement, not simply as someone going around shouting Korean independence or waving a Korean flag, which was enough to get you killed. She will actually help organize and lead some of the demonstrations. Because of that, she will eventually be arrested. Her resistance will continue in prison, and she will essentially be tortured and beaten until she falls ill and dies. So this shows us something about how what we call colonial modernity can work. You see this transformation of this young lady and her circumstances in a way that's becoming more modern, right? This is a Korean woman from the provinces who's becoming active in politics, not because she's married to an emperor or the mother of a king or something like that, but on her own, through her own talent and education, right? She's not gaining power because she is in a relationship with a powerful man. she's able to take part in politics because of her own skills and her own education. In addition, and as a member of the nation, and women just didn't do that in traditional Korea unless they were married to someone that was powerful, and certainly not women from the provinces. But because she lives in a colonial situation where her country is controlled by Japan, this ends tragically, right? Her political interest ends in her death. So this shows us, in a sense, right, the problems with what we call colonial modernity, having your country becoming modern while it's a colony. It can lead easily to this tragedy where you have this gifted young woman who could have done a lot of great things for her country, dying for her country, right? She becomes a martyr and is celebrating Korea today as a patriotic martyr. But what if she could have lived? How much could she have continued to contribute to her country? So what was the results of the March 1st movement? What impact did it have? Well, it failed in its immediate goal. Koreans had hoped that national self-determination would apply to them. However, Japan was a winner in World War I, and national self-determination was only applied to the losers, only people who had been part of the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian or the German Empire would be given their own countries in accordance with that principle of national self-determination. The colonies of the Allies, such as the Philippines or India, would not have this apply to them, and of course it did not apply to Japan. It was on the side of the Allies. However, as we've seen before and we discussed, this was a mass movement. This wasn't a movement simply of educated men or officials. It was a mass movement, and about 1 million Koreans will participate. That's pretty impressive when we remember that 20 million people approximately lived in Korea. So about 1 in every 20 Koreans actually participated in this movement. As we've seen before, it involves new actors. Young women like Kwansun are acting as leaders and organizers of this movement. And what's happening is nationalism is spreading based on this experience of colonization and ethnic discrimination. As Koreans encounter Japanese officials, as they encounter colonial officials, even if especially the police, even if they're Koreans, they realize what it means to be colonized, what it means to be discriminated against. It means to be treated as a second-class citizen, or we should say subject, in their own country. Right? They're experiencing this firsthand, and this is leading many Koreans to say, wow, we would really like to be independent because this is just a terrible situation. So we're having this increasingly nationalistic Korea, right? The response to colonization is not for most Koreans to say, let's be like the Japanese. The response is, we don't like being part of the Japanese Empire. We want to be separate. The Japanese response to this is to move from military rule to what's called cultural rule, right? To move from military rule to what's called cultural rule. Basically, on an international level, the March 1st movement was really embarrassing, right? These March 1st protests just really embarrassed the Japanese. In particular, as it was revealed that the Japanese were attacking civilians, peaceful demonstrations, that they were engaging in torture, particularly of young Korean female students. That was particularly embarrassing to the Japanese. And so they realized they needed to make reforms, right? Japan wanted to show that it was a civilized country to the entire world. It wanted people to take Japan seriously, and this made the Japanese look really bad. So after this, they're going to allow more freedom of the press and assembly, right? Koreans will get to publish their own newspapers, for example. They will be censored, but Koreans are able to be given a certain amount of space to talk, to discuss political ideas. Flogging will be ended, and there's an image there to show you what I meant. But when I said flogging, as you can see, it's a very humiliating and painful punishment. The victim's legs or pants are pulled down, and they are beaten on their buttocks. Women, usually they would not have that done to them. Instead, their shins would be beaten, which was equally painful, but not as humiliating. Koreans officials, for example, would start getting paid the same as Japanese officials. So, for example, in the past, you would have Japanese and Koreans doing the same job, but Koreans would get paid less. Now, this looks good on paper, but this unfortunately is kind of typical, because what happened was Koreans got the same salaries, but Japanese were given the same salary, but they were also given bonuses, right? So if you looked at the salaries, they were the same, but the Japanese received bonuses that the Koreans didn't get. So there were some reforms. There were degrees to how real they were, right? So for example, Japan would promise to develop education further, but while making that promise public and making some developments in education, like I say, they were limited. What they really focused on was increasing the amount of police. That's what they tended to focus on. So there are some changes. A lot of them are cosmetic, but others are real. Koreans are given more freedom to speak, to talk, and to share ideas, and to talk about what it means to be Korean, and that is a real change. So now Koreans have to figure out what to do. It's clear now that Japan is willing to use a lot of violence to keep control over Korea. Right? Japan used a lot of violence, killed about 5,000 Koreans to put down the March 1st movement. It's also clear that no other country is going to intervene on behalf of Korea to help Koreans. So the Koreans have to figure out what they want to do. They also need to figure out, who do they want to be like? Right? What model should they pursue? So you may recall earlier we talked about how in the 1880s and 90s there was this kind of conflict in Korea. Do we follow a Japanese model or a Chinese model? And you remember there was a group that said we want to follow an American model, though that one wasn't as strong because the Korea had a monarchy. So now there's this question, who do we be like? Now, some Koreans still will say we need to be like the Japanese. And to understand them, it's kind of difficult because they're the villains today. In Korea, the Koreans who collaborated with Japan, who worked with Japan, are typically seen as the villains who sold out the country. And some of them they were like that. They were, for example, you had police officers who didn't care, who were Korean, and who used their power as police officers to beat up other Koreans and oppress them for their own profit. So you have collaborators like that who just flat out supported Japan because Japan was powerful, and then they could be powerful if they worked with Japan, and they didn't care if that meant beating up on other Koreans. That's going to cause some serious divisions. You had other Koreans, though, who chose to work with Japan because they really didn't see an alternative. Japan was willing to use all this force to control Korea, and so some Koreans said, look, we're going to be part of the Japanese Empire whether we like it or not. So let's just do our best to work with the Japanese to make the best Korea we can. And if we prove ourselves to be loyal, useful members of the empire, we will profit as part of the empire. That perspective, like I said, is heavily criticized in Korea today. It's not an unreasonable perspective to take, I would argue, as a historian. Right? I understand why Koreans are angry, especially when you have people who, like I said, just followed Japan because it was powerful and did other terrible things to other Koreans. But some Koreans who chose to work with Japan did so because they thought it was the best way to get what good they could out of a bad situation. There's other Koreans who say, though, we want independence. We do not want to work with the Japanese. And we want to make Korea look like the United States. Right? They're not going to look so much to Great Britain because they've basically given up on the Korean monarchy, so they want to make Korea look like the United States. And they followed a perspective we call cultural nationalism. Basically, cultural nationalism is very closely connected to Shin Chae-ho's idea that the spirit of Korea lives on even though the body, the state, has fallen apart. And if we develop the Korean nation, we can get to the point where we can obtain independence. They weren't always clear about how they would do this, right? It seems to me that Japan, really wanted to keep control of Korea, so it's not clear how these guys are going to get independence. But they said basically, this is the only way we can really do anything right now. Let's work on building up Korea. Let's build up who we are as a nation. Let's become more modern. And doing that, we will eventually become independent. So there's a lot of similarities between the people who say we should be like Japan and be like the United States in terms of what they want to do. Right? They want to both have this idea that they can develop Korea, that they can make Korea a better place to live, that they can make it more modern. It's just that the ones who want to work with Japan think that they will stay a part of the Japanese empire. The ones who work with the United States believe that by making Korea, or who want to be like the United States, they believe that by making Korea more modern, that will eventually lead to independence. So the cultural nationalists want to focus on developing the nation through things like education, through journals like what you have on the left, to making a better Korean nation so they can one day regain independence. And then they want to make their country look like the United States. You have others who want to make Korea look like the Soviet Union. We'll talk more about communism later. We'll talk more about that when we get to China, because communism is more important to the Chinese story than the Korean story. But I do want to emphasize that there were Koreans who wanted to make Korea look like the Soviet Union, and they tend to be the most active in overtly resisting the Japanese empire, right? The Japanese could tolerate cultural nationalism. They would absolutely not tolerate communism. Several times the Korean communists tried to form a communist party in Korea, and the Japanese kept like destroying it like as soon as they founded it. So they tended to be more active in their resistance to Japan, right? Because Japan was not going to tolerate them. They wanted to fight back, and they hoped to make Korea look like the Soviet Union. So you can see there's a problem here. There's a division, first of all, between Koreans who believe that they have no choice but to stay part of the Japanese empire, or who actively want to stay part of the Japanese empire, and those who want independence. That's the first division. Then you have a division among Koreans over what Korea should look like. You know, should it look like Japan? Should it look like the United States? Or should it look like the Soviet Union? And then they argue about means. Should we engage in cultural nationalism? Or do we need to focus on fighting? Like, do we need to pick up pens and write to develop our Korean nation? Or do we need to pick up guns and fight to liberate that nation? And a lot of this just simply had to do with where you lived. If you're in the Korean Peninsula, it's very hard to be a communist. On the other hand, if you're in Manchuria or China or the Soviet Union, you can be a Korean communist. It's much easier. If you want to be a cultural nationalist, you can do that on the peninsula. It's a bit easier to do in the United States. But one thing I just really want to highlight is you can see now that there are deep divisions within among Koreans, and this is going to help lead to the Korean War and the continued division of Korea. So I would like to look at two Koreans, I think, who show these divisions very well and who are going to be extraordinarily important as we continue on with this section and with this class. So the first one is a man named Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee was from a Yongbon family, and very early in life was a reformer. He was someone who wanted to fix the Korean government in order to make it independent and strong. He was a convert to Protestant Christianity. He was baptized a Presbyterian, and he became a big believer in American-style liberalism. He therefore participated in the Independence Club. You'll remember that the Independence Club was eventually crushed under the suspicions that it wanted to make Korea into a republic. And of course, the king did not like that. For his political activities, he would be imprisoned by the Korean government. Fortunately, because he came from a wealthy family, they basically bribed the Korean government so they wouldn't punish him too severely, and he was eventually let go. He would leave Korea for Hawaii, and he would get really, really good at English. Syngman Rhee, and he started studying English before he went to Hawaii, but he got really, really good at English. And he went to Hawaii, made more contacts with Koreans abroad. There were lots of Koreans, several thousand in Hawaii by this time, who were making a living cutting sugar cane. Helped to organize a community there. Later returned to Korea. After Korea gets annexed, it's too dangerous for him, so he will go back to Hawaii and will actually become very active in the United States. And he will be what I would like to call a diplomatic warrior. He is not going to pick up a gun to fight the Japanese. He says there's no way we could possibly defeat the Japanese, basically. Instead, he will focus on using diplomacy in an attempt to regain Korean independence. That's what his main goal is going to be. And that's why he's going to focus in particular on the United States. Syngman Rhee realizes correctly that, in a sense, Japan and the United States are competitors in the Pacific. Both are competing in the Pacific Ocean for power, and that will eventually lead to conflict between them. And if he can try and get then the United States to support Korean independence, that conflict could lead to Korean independence. So in a sense, Syngman Rhee is playing an updated version of the old Korean diplomatic game, the diplomatic strategy of trying to get a powerful neighbor to support Korea and to help Korea out. And he's going to play that game very well. And so he's going to focus on the United States to get Korea, to help Korea one day obtain independence. And his goal is to make Korea into a country similar to the United States. So this is one avenue, and some people will criticize Syngman Rhee, some people will support him. But this will end up being one of the successful ways that Korea will become independent. Syngman Rhee's arch enemy and competitor will be a man named Kim Il-sung. You maybe are familiar with the Kim dynasty in North Korea, Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung is their grandfather and father. Kim Il-sung will lead a group, become involved with the communists. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, and I'll talk more about communism later, is I don't think communism helps us to understand North Korea very well. I think fascism helps us understand North Korea a lot better. But Kim Il-sung is going to support communism. Now, it's interesting, he came from a Christian family from northern Korea, not far from where An Chun-gun is actually from. They were Presbyterians, and that puts them in touch with ideas of nationalism and ideas of freedom and so forth and independence. And Kim Il-sung will not take to the Christian part, but he will take to ideas of making Korea independent. As a child, his family, which was nationalist, his family were fervent nationalists. Because of Japanese pressure and power in Korea, they will flee to Manchuria. He will receive essentially the equivalent of a high school education. That might not be very impressive to us, but that put him basically in the top couple percent of Koreans in this time period by education. So this meant he was relatively highly educated. And through that education, he will become a communist. So he will be a communist nationalist. In other classes, I emphasize how theoretically those two things don't go together, but practically they go just fine. Basically, Kim Il-sung thought that communism was the best way for Korea to become independent and to stay independent. He thought that communism would help to build a strong Korea. Unlike Syngman Rhee, who turns to diplomacy, Kim Il-sung will become a guerrilla soldier, and he will fight the Japanese, primarily as a guerrilla soldier in Manchuria. And what's complex is he's operating in Manchuria, and the communists followed the principle of one country, one party. So Koreans who wanted to be members of the Communist Party in Manchuria had become members of the Chinese Communist Party. And so Kim Il-sung became a member of the Chinese Communist Party and would in fact become fluent in Chinese. That's very important. He's going to form a close connection, a close relationship with the Chinese communists. Now, from 1936 to 1939, he was a fairly successful guerrilla commander. There were limits to that success, like his most successful raid was killing a few policemen and basically destroying a Japanese police station. That's pretty good in this time period. The Japanese were very powerful, but you're not going to liberate Korea by destroying one police station, and that was basically the best thing he did. However, because he's so successful, the Japanese will put a lot of resources into trying to catch the guy. So in 1940, he will flee to the Soviet Union and will actually become officially a part of the Soviet army, and he will gain the rank of captain. And what's key about this, again, first of all, I'm just trying to show the different ways and opposing ways Koreans are reacting to the Japanese colonization of their country. They're resisting in different ways. They have different models. And in particular, what I want to emphasize is how Kim Il-sung now, you can see he has very close relationships to the Chinese communists and the Soviet communists. And that's key to understanding how he gains power in North Korea and how he will keep it.